A very good evening to everyone. Welcome to all who are joining us around the world for this very special talk entitled Mapping Short Film Production in Singapore, which is part of AFA's Singapore Shorts 21 program, now screening at the Oldham Theatre. My name is Karen Chan. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Film Archive. We are very privileged this evening to have with us Sophia Siddique as speaker on this topic of the short film form in Singapore cinema. Sophia is Associate Professor in the Department of Film at Vassar College. She received a PhD in Critical Studies from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, and her research interests include Singapore cinema, representations of trauma and memory in Cambodian, Indonesian, and Thai cinema. She co-edited a 2016 publication entitled Transnational Horror Cinema, Bodies of Access and the Global Grotesque. And we're looking forward to Sophia's upcoming manuscript that she's currently completing, entitled Screening Singapore, Sensuous Citizenship, Formulations, and the National. Well, before I turn the screen over to Sophia, please do send in any questions any time during the talk, and we will try to answer them as fast as possible, and Sophia will address them accordingly. So without further ado, I would like to now welcome Sophia. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. I want to extend my thanks to Karen, Vignesh, Tipao, and Kiwi for the invitation to speak today, for providing amazing logistical support between Singapore and New York, and for sharing resources with me in preparation for this talk. I would also like to thank the National Museum of Singapore Cinematheque, Zhang Wenjie, and Warren Sin for permission to use still images from two short films, A Question of Lust and The Garden, which you will see eventually in the talk. In an outreach email publicizing Singapore Shorts 21, the Asian Film Archive proclaimed, quote, "The future of local cinema is here," end quote. This proclamation provides an elegant transition to the subject of my talk today, the centrality of the short film form in Singapore cinema. More short films are produced in Singapore than feature films. This makes sense because short films tend to be less capital intensive. And depending on the context of exhibition and distribution, short films can evade the clutches of censorship. Yet Singapore film historiography, or writings on Singapore film history, tend to grant little critical visibility to this potent form of filmmaking. There are many reasons for this, and I'll mention four briefly. One, the short film form straddles an array of ephemeral conceptual categories like amateur professional, popular avant-garde, fiction, non-fiction, experimental. And this makes the exercise of theorizing the short film form rather slippery. For example, the short film can defy an auteurist approach or genre criticism, both theoretical frameworks most often used in film studies to engage with the feature film. Two, defining the temporal limit of the short film form proves to be equally as challenging. For example, I define the short film as any film under 55 minutes. The Asian Film Archive defines the short film for Singapore Shorts as a film under 30 minutes, while Video 88, a filmmaking competition organized by the People's Association and the Singapore Cine and Video Club in 1988, defines the short film as any film under 15 minutes. Number three, the short film form has often and undeservedly been characterized as derivative of the feature film, serving merely as a proof of concept for a larger feature film project. The short film's itinerant and nomadic nature in terms of production, exhibition, and distribution makes a comprehensive survey of the short film notoriously difficult to track. An extreme example might be a filmmaker who only makes one short film with no theatrical release or a path through international film festival circuits. With these challenges in mind, There are peer-reviewed academic publications that do attempt to theorize the short film as its very own poetic form. For example, Short Film Studies, first published in 2011 by Intellect Books, holds as its critical mission, quote, to encourage research by new and established scholars and critics that reflects both the historical importance and the increasing prominence and diversity of short films in today's media landscape, end quote. The structure of that journal highlights one short film per issue, with an analysis of that film through a variety of theoretical perspectives, followed by an interview with the film's director. While laudable, the journal does not grapple nearly enough with the sheer range and diverse forms of the short film. In many of the scholarly writings on Singapore cinema, the completed feature film is the dominant star, casting the short film very much in its shadows. In particular, the revival narrative dominates Singapore film historiography, or the writing of Singapore film history. The narrative goes somewhat like this: the end of the studio era of Shaw and Cathay Chris, a smattering of independent filmmaking in the 1970s, a dearth of filmmaking activity in the 1980s, followed by a revival in the 1990s of Singapore cinema. Other scholars like Gerald Sim argue for a historical narrative that does not elide the colonial threads between pre-independent Singapore and post-independent Singapore. Jan Ude and Yvonne Ng Ude do devote an entire chapter on the short film form in Singapore in their work Latent Images. As you can already see, there are rich and varied perspectives to understand the development of Singapore cinema. What I offer in the remainder of my talk is another entry point of view into how we make sense of Singapore cinema, and particularly the short film. First, I ask, what counts as a film in the first place? For example, do we mean a completed feature film or a short film that only receives distribution? What about unfinished films? How does a Singapore film historiography account for that? Such questions are key because as scholars, critics, curators, and all of you as spectators, what we privilege or give visibility to shape the films that count in writings on Singapore film history. Our definitions and selections shape, contour, and define the boundaries of a Singapore cinema. The narrative that I construct and offer redefines the term film industry to adopt a more fluid understanding of production by including non-studio or non-institutional modes of filmmaking. Production, as I define the term, encompasses three areas of filmmaking: institutional, which is often considered studio, independent, and grassroots. I want to stress that these areas of production are dynamic, they fluctuate, sometimes they overlap in uneasy ways, and they respond or are responsive to different sociocultural, political, and economic moments and across decades. So for example, Cathay Chris and Shaw Brothers were studios at the height of their dominance in the 1950s and early 1960s, while we might consider Raintree Pictures MediaCorp as a studio presence in the late 1990s and 2000s. A more expansive definition of film industry transforms the 1980s, a period again characterized by dearth in the revival narrative, into a vibrant decade of grassroots filmmaking centered on the short film form. Unfortunately, right now, I don't have clips of the films to show you. What I will share with you are still images from these films and newspaper headlines from the 1980s. And I hope that these sources will still help you to imagine the vibrant period of filmmaking activity in the 1980s. The Singapore Cine Club, SCC, founded in 1961, proved to be a key player in the grassroots filmmaking sphere of the 1980s. Its outreach programming sought to extend film appreciation and production beyond the confines of SCC membership to the wider Singaporean public. The SCC changed its name to the Singapore Cine and Video Club in 1982 to accommodate the increasing shift from film to video. The impact and proliferation of video technology in Singapore in the 1980s cannot be underestimated. 1 in 5 households owned a VCR, with almost 6 million blank tapes imported during the first 9 months of 1982 alone. By 1984, approximately 500 video cameras and 350 VCRs were being sold on a monthly basis, and Singapore proved to be, quote, among the world's biggest buyers of video recorders, end quote. You see that in the headline right now. In 1983, the Singapore Cine Video Club joined forces with the People's Association, the PA, to conduct video workshops and jointly to organize an annual video competition. The People's Association, PA, was an organization founded by the state to foster ties with Singaporeans. They administered community centers throughout the island. These community centers organized social activities, provided access to recreational facilities, and in the 1980s, offered video production courses as part of its community outreach programming. Participating community centers included Queenstown, Boon Lay, Marine Parade, Kallang, Bukit Timah, Geylang East, Juchat, Bras Basah, and Hong Lim. The Marine Parade Community Center was the first to form a video club in 1984. A spokesperson of the People's Association then said, quote, our movie-making course held at the Marine Parade Community Center in 1984 drew a very encouraging response, and so we have decided to launch a series of courses on video production, end quote. Michael Fu, a member and then also president of the Singapore Cine and Video Club, taught some of the courses. In a 1985 Singapore Monitor interview, Mr. Fu stated, quote, no educational institutions here have offered such a course on a full-time or part-time basis, and what the People's Association has done is reach out to those interested in video production, provide the facilities and avenues to enable them to take part in video-related competitions, end quote. I include this quote by Michael Fu to highlight the fact that the formal educational ecosystem of film programs was not yet at a critical mass in the 1980s. For example, Ngee Ann Polytechnic's diploma in film, sound, and video was only established in 1993, though the institution did have a diploma in mass comm in 1989. The first annual competition for amateur filmmakers in 1983 carried no thematic restrictions on films for submission. Hagamaya Electronics, agents for National, Panasonic, and Technic video products, donated $25,000 worth of prizes. The categories of competition reflected both the grassroots mode of production and nationalist sentiments, as only Singapore citizens and residents could compete in the open section, while students enrolled in schools, tertiary institutions, and colleges were eligible to enter the student section. And this tidbit I found particularly fascinating in my research, so I wanted to include it here. The 1984 Singapore Amateur Movie Competition recognized the centrality of students' creative voices by changing its submission deadline so that there were no conflicts between the students' desire for filmmaking and school exams. The PA SVVC workshops and the Singapore Video Competition, therefore, not only fostered the growth of grassroots filmmaking in Singapore, but also echoed the rich potential of video as a medium to participate in constructing alternative stories and personal narratives within the fabric of Singapore as a city-nation. In particular, I wish to highlight 3 award-winning entries out of the 41 short films submitted to the 1984 Singapore Amateur Movie Competition. This competition, in addition to the student section and the open section, had another category, the special section. For the special section, the entries must, quote, reflect Singapore's development and achievements in any field in the past 25 years. This is in keeping with the current interest to capture our 25 years of nation building, end quote. For the student section, I want to highlight an entry called Death Date, submitted by 17 boarders from St. Patrick's School. Death Date was an adaptation from a science fiction novel, And there were actually 3 student directors credited with death date. According to the program synopsis, the film is, quote, a story about a teenager who discovers a method to predict a person's date of death, end quote. The film won a Merit Award in the student section. The winner of the open section was a 20-minute film by Stephen Lam Kar-chung called Towards a Better Understanding. The synopsis of the film states, quote, problems that the physically handicapped have to face in public and a call for a better understanding of their plight, end quote. The judges in the open section commented that the film, quote, had a touching message effectively delivered, end quote. Tan Bi Hong won second prize in the open section, second prize in the special section, and the Best Photography Award for her film, The Best Is Yet to Be. Her film explores, quote, the important achievements of Singapore in the past 25 years, end quote. She had wanted to feature subjects like the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, Changi Airport, and, quote, the upcoming mass rapid transit system, end quote. Journalist Kanan Chandran writes of Tan Bi Hong's shooting experiences in 1984, quote, in the case of the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, it was a most definite no, even before the full request was uttered. But, being a resourceful person, she brought a ticket to one of the concerts, smuggled in her camera and tripod, and towards the end of the night's performance, set up equipment and started filming. Then, while shooting on Pulau Tekong, she chanced upon a Singapore Armed Forces military camp. She decided to film the in-camp activities from the public road running parallel to the camp. Unfortunately, an observant soldier noticed her and notified his captain, and now her videotape is sitting in an army office, probably never to see a videocassette recorder again, end quote. I hope that these excerpts give you a sense of the kinds of films that were produced for the 1984 competition, and also some insight into the shooting process of some of these filmmakers. While these may be names of filmmakers whom you may not recognize, there are filmmakers whose names you may. Ong An Meng, now credited as Meng Ong, directed his first feature film, Miss Wonton, in 2001. Prior to his win in the Singapore Short Film category at the 1992 Singapore International Film Festival with Waves of a Distant Shore, Ong was a Temasek Junior College student when he submitted the prize-winning entry at the 1984 Singapore Amateur Movie Competition called News for Frankie, The Dream Against the World. He won not only the first prize in the student section, the most creative award, but also the Special Judges Award, which apparently was considered the, quote, equivalent of the Best Film Award in the Oscars, end quote. According to the synopsis, the film is a, quote, boy's discovery of the world outside and that of inner self. It all happened in a dream. The haziness in the video is the same haziness that blurs the world every day, end quote. In an interview, Meng Ong says, quote, it is partly a reflection of the pangs of growing up and maturing, but there are other meanings you can read into it. I want to make movies that make you think, not movies which are like a dish. You eat it and then forget about it, end quote. What you see or might see flash in a bit are still images of The Garden, submitted to the 1985 Singapore Amateur Film Competition. Like News for Frankie, Ong takes the spectator into the inner lives of his characters, this time the lives of 2 sisters. We see each sister's subjective state of mind as they both encounter a man in their garden. One sister projects death and loss onto the body of the man, while the other imagines the man as a subject of her erotic fantasy. Other filmmakers you may recognize include Eric Khoo and Royston Tan. Eric Khoo submitted A Question of Lust to the Video 88 Awards, Singapore Video Competition, in 1988, while still in NS. He won a $500 merit prize in the open section and the Most Creative Award with $400. The synopsis of the film, quote, a rich lady falls in love with a poor man, is a bitter experience for the man when the lady decides to end their relationship, end quote. This synopsis doesn't quite capture the visceral and tactile qualities of the film, nor the rousing soundtrack to Depeche Mode's A Question of Lust. And that's the image, still image that you see in the background. And even as a student, Royston Tan won a second prize for the music video category with his entry Erase at the 9th Panasonic Video Awards in 1996. The Singapore Video Competition, which, as you can see, changed names several times throughout its run, was held every year from 1983 to 1986, and then moved to being held every 2 years, finally ending its prolific run in 1996. The local short film festival ecosystem continues to flourish. For example, the Singapore International Film Festival, established in 1987, continues to feature the short film within its roster of competition. Eric Koo won the festival's inaugural Best Film with August in 1991. The Substation, established in 1990, provided another space for showcasing short films with its Moving Image program, established in 1997, and initiatives like the Singapore Shortcuts in 2004, in partnership with the Singapore Film Commission and the Singapore History Museum, Singapore National Museum. I am certainly disheartened to hear about the Substation's fate, as I myself took a 16mm filmmaking course there at the Substation in 1991. And certainly the Asian Film Archive's initiative of Singapore Shorts is vital in highlighting, preserving, and exhibiting Singapore short films. Some threads from the film descriptions I've shared with you find their resonant expressions in the films that you are either about to experience or already have in Singapore Shorts. For example, one can see the pain and dislocation of adolescence in Tuition by Alistair Kwok, a graduate in digital filmmaking from NTU, whose film centers on Alan, a 13-year-old protagonist who must navigate the sadism of his tuition teacher. And it brought my experience of tuition in Singapore, in primary school and early secondary school to mind as well, in very embodied ways. Or I might even highlight Eric Koo as producer for the irreverent animated film Piece of Meat, directed by Gerald Chong and Huang Chunxiang. For me, Singapore Shorts 21 exemplifies the potent power and mesmerizing qualities of the short film. The screenings celebrate the short film's breadth of form with experimental, animation, fiction, nonfiction, and hybrids. The short films showcase a plethora of languages and dialects, including English, Singlish, Mandarin, Bahasa Indonesia, Malay, Teochew, Hokkien, and Kristang. The short films engage with an array of lived experiences, touching on representations of race, of queer desire, of the painful impact of incarceration on families, just to name a few. In conclusion, I draw inspiration from producer and filmmaker Juan Fu, who incidentally won a Merit Award for his film Soul Sword Broken Heart at the 9th Panasonic Video Awards in 1996. He wrote in 2002 that, quote, "A nation's cinema starts with shorts," end quote. I agree 100%. In my talk, I focused on the short film and its contributions to Singapore film history, especially with the grassroots filmmaking of the 1980s. As you enjoy your journey through Singapore Shorts 21, I invite you to consider how these films and how you, as a spectator, contribute to our shared understanding of the place of the short film in Singapore cinema. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sophia. I think we probably have audience who might have questions, but on this note that you've ended on the short film form of the 1980s, I do want to perhaps remind our audience, or also for those who are unaware at this point, that the Asian Film Archive has made an open call for 1980s short films and videos. So any one of you who might actually be holding on to some of these cinematic material, or know of people who might have them in their bedrooms and attics and storerooms, it would be great if they could come forth. We have launched the open call, and there is a Google form that you can fill up with some information so that we can contact you or the people that you might know of, and we can help to assess what condition the material is in, and we can take it from there to add on to Singapore's cinematic heritage, based on the materials that might already be sitting there in somebody's home. So I really do urge you as the audience to tell people, to spread the word, and to come forth in sharing any of these materials that you may be aware of. Right. And I think, Sophia, you can agree with me that it's going to be really exciting to see what this call unearths. Because for the longest time, like you said, we've always said, oh, there's 1980s is a time where there was no films, no feature films that were made, and then we cut short the sort of the discussion, right? So I guess maybe I will start the questions rolling. When you started your research on the 1980s period of Singapore cinema, what were some of the challenges that you faced? And perhaps, as you moved along into the research and even up to now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Karen. Thank you for asking that. So I think my journey through the 1980s and researching the 1980s presented both, I think, methodological challenges, but also pleasure. Because you're right. I mean, it was a challenge trying to reconstruct a decade that had very little visibility. So I, started with newspaper articles of the 1980s. I went through articles from, let's say, the Singapore Monitor, started getting all of these headlines about these video competitions and People's Association, and then just started to follow up, trying to get into contact with folks at the People's Association, and then also looking at what we do when we do historical research, whatever we can find, film programs, internal memos, notes from judges. So it was a reconstruction that was not necessarily centered on the moving image itself, but all of the other ancillary materials that are also very, very key to providing texture or nuance or depth to the filmmaking activity that was going on. And I think when I started reading all of these different headlines, I thought, why shouldn't we spend a considerable amount of time on the 1980s? Because it goes back to how do we define what counts? As I mentioned, your job as in the Asian Film Archive, my job as an academic, all of our members of the audience, we all contribute to shaping the boundaries of a Singapore cinema. And I wanted to, I struggled, I should say, to find a definition that would be able to accommodate and incorporate films that were not feature films, and that films that were not necessarily released in what we would automatically assume are the quote-unquote normal channels of distribution or exhibition, or even through the more structured and established film festival circuits. And as you can see, there were filmmakers who made those films very passionately alongside their careers, and maybe they've continued making those films. That's why I hope that anybody in the audience who knows anyone, please do encourage them to submit. And then there were other filmmakers who really decided that this was their passion, and they had the space to be able to explore and experiment, and that continued on to their trajectories as full-time filmmakers. So I think the 1980s, really does deserve much greater critical attention, and so I'm very happy to read about the open call and to see, what sorts of materials come in, and figure it out from there.
So, given that those were the initial challenges for the early part of, did you perhaps in the last decade, or maybe in terms of your research, find that filmmakers who started off as short filmmakers and then went on to their feature films, did you kind of, as you studied their works, I suppose, did you see how perhaps the short film could have I don't know, maybe molded them in some ways, or gave them sort of an impetus in terms of how they structured their feature? I mean, it's just something that it's worth considering, I suppose.
Sure. I think looking at the works of Eric Koo, particularly A Question of Lust, and then also looking at his earlier submissions with the Singapore International Film Festival, his films have a very visceral quality to them, and very tactile. And I think Question of Lust has that kind of very visceral, raw quality. So I can see that kind of connective strand. And with Tan Pin Pin's work, she does work in under an hour, sometimes over an hour, but her work is not necessarily what we would consider feature length work. Something that's like an hour and a half, or close to 2 hours. So there are some filmmakers who really push the boundaries and edges of the short film form, which again, as I mentioned in my talk, is challenging because of the temporal limits in terms of how do you even define a short film, because even in our conversation, the Asian Film Archive's definition of a short film and my definition of a short film are already quite different. So that actually has been the other methodological challenge, just in terms of grappling with, what are the poetics of the short film form in and of itself? And then how do you really push the boundaries of that form when you're dealing with a form that has such a great plasticity in terms of, genres and types of films, and then also of such varying lengths, from, it could be a 5-second long take or whatever, to something that's, 55 minutes. And so there are various trajectories, critical and analytical trajectories you can go. So one organizing logic would be your question, which is tracing, the development of a Singapore filmmaker from his or her or their nascent formative creative practice in the short film, and seeing how it unspools or becomes expressed in the feature film format. And that is absolutely one way to go. At the same time, that's also kind of grappling with the auteurist approach, with the director as the quote unquote author. And that at the same time then might bracket out other short film makers who, again, this might be their, second or third, and that's it. So the boundaries are so elastic, that for me, in my own research, in my own thinking of the form itself, I'm still trying to figure out how to actually not necessarily turn to what we normally do with feature film, which is, as I mentioned in my talk, generally a genre criticism or kind of a tourist approach. In the end, it might be the way to go, but I'm not sure. Also, I think some of it is organic, and it's iterative in the sense that, there might be a whole other way of speaking about and organizing when the Asian Film Archive receives the material. And so part of it is also being open to serendipity and kind of like curiosity and adventure.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted. We have two questions, and I think they've just come in. So let's see. So Matthew Young says hello and thank you for sharing your research with digital platforms such as YouTube, Vimeo, social media, and its far reach. Do you think prizes and competitions continue to be relevant for contemporary short filmmakers?
I think this is a great question, Matthew. Thank you for asking that. I think, as with all things, it really depends on what the filmmaker wants to do. So, for example, prizes, it's a form of branding. It's very strategic. It can be used, for your CV, for entering yet another festival or for securing funding. So there are strategic reasons for why prizes and competitions might serve the interests of the filmmaker. That's one thing. And there are other filmmakers who may want to now, with the prevalence of online streaming platforms and social media, just sort of quote unquote release or upload their films to these streaming platforms for the sake of uploading and getting their work out. So I think it really depends on the particular filmmaker and their kind of strategic vision for their work and their creative practice.
Yeah. Okay, that's the first question. The second question is from Courtney Chen, who thanks you for your fascinating talk. And he's asked, you mentioned that short films tend to be excluded from narratives of Singapore film history with the proliferation, but also disaccreditation, aggregation of new forms of media. What possible roles do you see this particular form playing in our cultural landscape moving ahead?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it is interesting because in my model of kind of a looser, more flexible definition of film industry with grassroots filmmaking, independent and studio, it is going to be interesting to kind of see how these spheres interact in the next few years. What do I mean by that? I mean, with grassroots filmmaking, it was through the People's Association and the Singapore Cine and Video Club. Then you can kind of think about the very pivotal role the substation played with all of its, film production programming, and I have some research on the 1990s with Monster Films and the Guerrilla Filmmaking Workshop. And the filmmaking workshop I took with, yes, George Cardona. Some of you may know, some of you may not know that name. So it is interesting to see what shape grassroots filmmaking will take in this kind of media landscape. I do think that no matter what platform, whether we're talking about new forms of media or analog or the VHS tape and medium, the short film is always going to be. I guess the talk is recorded, so this is what I'll say in posterity. Posterity, that it will always be a very important form in Singapore cinema because of, as I mentioned, it's less capital intensive. Now with your mobile phone, you can make a film on your phone and upload it. And there are more, film programs at colleges and tertiary institutions. So I think the form itself will always be there, and the beauty of that form is how plastic it is, how flexible it is, how responsive it is. So I think it'll still perform a very key role in our cultural landscape moving ahead.
Okay, I think it will. Judging from the films that we've been seeing in Singapore Shorts this year, I think that it's a form of that we're not going to see go away, definitely, and people are finding ways to express themselves in this format. We do have a question coming in from Vic. He is asking if you could perhaps talk a little bit about where films set within the larger art scene in Singapore back in the 1980s and 90s. Were there many overlaps in terms of the practitioners and audiences in these different artistic disciplines? And how did that translate into the larger cultural output and, at that time?
I think so. First of all, like with the People's Association and the Singapore Cine Video Club, while the Singapore Cine Video Club held its workshops, right, at these different community centers throughout Singapore, the video competition wasn't just reserved for people who had taken those courses. So the competitions were advertised widely in the newspapers and were open to the general public. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of maybe make more clear. So it was tapping into a much larger zeitgeist of the time in terms of people who are interested in making moving images. I would say, and please, anybody out there in the ether willing to, wanting to disagree with me, or maybe it's nostalgia, but for me, the 1980s and the 1990s were wonderful in terms of the art scene in Singapore. At that time, I'm going to use SBC, Singapore Broadcasting Corporation, because that's what it was at the time, had really robust programming in the sense of Friday Background, right, which was a political current affairs program, feedback, and then a program for Singapore youth called Contact Y, which I was involved in, where we took stories that were relevant to Singapore youths and shared them through the platform Contact Y. And also, let's not forget Singapore theatre scene, both English language theatre, Chinese language theatre, Tamil theatre. These were all really prolific and robust in the 80s and particularly in the 1990s. So I think that just in terms of the cultural landscape and the arts landscape, and particularly also for me, the central role of the substation as a space in which cross-fertilized all of these different, arts spheres, let's just say, tapped into also what was going on in grassroots filmmaking. So it was highly, highly productive and prolific. And again, remembering this was also a time, before National Arts Council was just starting, to be established. There was no Singapore Film Commission at that point, So this was really a wonderful, creative and imaginative time in Singapore in the 80s and mid 1990s.
Yeah, I think just moving from the cultural landscape that we're talking about, I remember growing up in the 70s, the people who had the means would actually, do a lot of home videos right into the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
Do you see that sort of trajectory, moving from that home video into the short film form in that sense?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important question because it again comes down to nomenclature, classification, and where are the boundaries, and I prefer to. But there's quite a lot of theory written on the home movies as a separate sort of genre. But my definition perhaps is too elastic. I don't know. This is still a process of exploration, but I would actually bring those into the fold of the short film form, and then see where that takes. Because again, if it's too porous, the term means nothing. If it's too restrictive, then it just excises so much other material. So it's always this delicate tension, and it's a productive tension. And I hope that we'll see what happens if the Asian Film Archive gets more of the home movies, then that might open up a different conversation as well.
Right. Yeah. We do have one more question that has just come in. This is from Yo Ming Hui, and she's entered the session later, and then she's just wanting to apologize for this, but she's also thinking about the possibility of constructing a longer short film history narrative in the context of Singapore cinema, considering how cinema itself arrived in the form of short film, and how short film remains a vibrant and generative platform or medium for filmmaking in Singapore today. I wonder why the 80s in particular saw a resurgence of this form.
Um,
Oh, and it continues, or her,
oh, yeah.
her question continues that also, how does this development in Singapore cinema compare with parallel trajectories in the region?
Yeah. So I absolutely agree with your point. And I think that if in reading Gerald Sim's work, he would argue, Gerald might be in the audience, sorry. My interpretation of what Gerald's argument might be is that yes, there was filmmaking activity in the colonial period that is by necessity, especially in the 1900s, for the short film form because of technology at that time, right? So yes, I mean the short film in various vestiges has been alongside and parallel the feature film sort of trajectory, and particularly the kind of arbitrary break between the colonial and the post-independent Singapore, or the post-colonial Singapore, is something that Gerald Sim argues ought not to be cleaved, right? So Minhui, I completely agree with you that yes, this kind of short film activity has much greater range and historical depth. As to the 1980s, I think one explanation, not to be kind of like a technologist and a materialist, but the accessibility of video was certainly something that was a catalyst, because prior to that, the Singapore Cine and Video Club taught courses in 8mm, in film production, which is definitely much more involved in terms of labor. So I think that the accessibility of video was a catalyst in terms of making filmmaking more participatory, or opening up that possibility of making film more participatory. And there were, and we can kind of think about digital video, right, and its impact in the 1990s, particularly, let's say, with the Malaysian New Wave. The first wave of independent filmmakers were working with digital filmmaking. And certainly the short film form is also very potent in Southeast Asia, and there are initiatives and festivals in terms of highlighting works by filmmakers who work in the short film form. So it's not just in the context of Singapore. I'm less aware of the 1980s in comparison to, well, what was happening in Indonesia and Malaysia, let's say, and Thailand in the 1980s, specific to short form filmmaking. But I can say that regionally, there is a celebration of the power and potency of the short film form, for sure.
Yeah, I please go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying great questions.
Yeah. I guess if anybody has any last questions, we probably have time for another question. And while we're waiting for that, perhaps, Sophia, your upcoming manuscript, for instance, I don't know if you're able to share a little bit with us, but does that actually delve into any part of this work that you've done at all, or it's just totally different?
Okay, so this is a great question. My manuscript looks at how Singapore films express belonging through the senses. So I look at taste. How do these films represent taste and touch and smell? So I'm not concentrating solely on vision. So I was very set. I had all my chapters set on the feature film. And then the email that I received from Karen and members of the Asian Film Archive to think about curating, this slate of the 1980s in the short film form was actually a gentle reminder from you all and the universe that I was reproducing what I was critiquing. And so I have now jettisoned one chapter, and I am incorporating the short film form as something that isn't just derivative or additive, but it's going to be central to the book. And so I am hoping that the submitted materials will also help inform and shape my argument for that chapter.
I see.
No
Excellent.
pressure, no pressure.
Yeah. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I really think you've given us some food for thought, and definitely I hope the audience has found this to be useful and to think about this in line with the audience who are in Singapore and are able to catch Singapore Shorts 21.
Yes.
There are more selections coming up this Friday and Saturday, so feel free to come join us for the screenings, and there will be articles, little pieces that we have we will be releasing on our blog, the AFA blog, to sort of respond to the films that some of these audience members may have seen. So I hope that would also add to that conversation and to that thought about the slate of films. So I guess
I would also say that that if anyone has questions that come to mind afterwards and would just like to send an email, please feel free to email me. My email is available on the Vassar Department of Film website, and I'm happy to respond to questions via email as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia, for that offer. Yeah. And I think at this juncture, we just want to perhaps end this conversation, but also to again remind everyone to please think about whether you may know someone who has something of that era, and that you could really think about submitting something for this particular call. And it's really just adding to the heritage that we will be preserving or can be preserved to that extent, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Sophia, and thank you for your time, for sharing all of those thoughts with us and with your research as well. I wish you all the best for your upcoming work, and
Thank you.
You have a good and fantastic day ahead.
Thank you.
For everyone who's here, we wish you a very good night, and hope to see you soon at one of AFA's events. Thank you.